The aftermath of Hurricane Milton was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. As the monstrous storm moved inland, it left behind a trail of devastation so extensive that even seasoned meteorologists struggled to grasp the enormity of its impact. But beyond the wreckage, the floodwaters, and the lives torn apart, there was something darker, something no one could explain. It started like any other hurricane. Warnings were issued days in advance, and people scrambled to prepare. Shelters were opened, windows boarded up, and highways became rivers of cars heading inland. But Milton was different. The meteorologists knew it, though they couldn't quite say why. The storm behaved erratically, changing direction without warning, gaining strength when it should have weakened. And then, as it approached land, it slowed down, hovering ominously over the coast. Those who had stayed behind described the silence before the storm as deafening. No birds, no whine, just an oppressive stillness that weighed heavily on the chest. Then, with a roar that shook the earth, Hurricane Milton made landfall. The winds tore through buildings like they were made of paper. Entire neighborhoods were submerged as the ocean surged inland, reclaiming the land in a single, violent push. But amidst the chaos, strange reports began to filter in, reports of things seen in the water, shadows moving against the tide, whispers carried on the wind. In the days following the storm, the real horror began. Rescue crews worked tirelessly to reach stranded survivors, but for every person they pulled from the wreckage, there were others who vanished without a trace. At first, it was chalked up to the storm people swept away by the floodwaters, their bodies likely carried miles away. But soon, the pattern became impossible to ignore. People were disappearing from areas that had already been cleared, from houses that hadn't been touched by the flood. One woman, found huddled on the roof of her house, recounted seeing her neighbor just before rescue arrived. He had been waving to her from his own rooftop, no more than 30 feet away. But when the rescue crew reached her, the man was gone, and his house was eerily untouched. As the days wore on, the disappearances continued. Entire families were found missing, their homes eerily pristine amidst the wreckage. And then there were the sounds, strange, guttural noises carried on the wind at night, and the feeling of being watched, even in the heart of the flooded ruins. The floodwaters didn't recede as expected. Despite clear skies, the water remained stubbornly high, almost as if the storm refused to relinquish its grip. It was then that the rumors started, rumors of creatures lurking in the flood, of shadows seen just beneath the surface. Fishermen along the coast, accustomed to hurricanes, spoke of strange fish washing ashore, twisted and deformed, their eyes wide and bulging, as if they had seen something unspeakable before their deaths. One rescue worker, exhausted after days of searching, claimed to have seen something move beneath the water. He described it as long, dark, and serpentine, something far larger than any fish he had ever encountered. When he tried to report it, his superiors brushed it off as fatigue, a trick of the light in the murky water. But he knew what he had seen, and he wasn't the only one. Survivors from one particularly devastated neighborhood spoke of hearing voices coming from the water at night, soft, pleading voices that called to them by name. One man, convinced his wife had survived, waded into the waist-deep water to search for her, despite warnings from his neighbors. He never returned, and in the morning, the water around his house had turned a deep, unsettling shade of red. The official death toll from Hurricane Milton continued to rise, but behind the scenes, there were whispers of far more unaccounted for. News outlets ran stories of heroic rescues and the resilience of the human spirit, but those on the ground knew there was more to the story. Entire rescue crews reported feeling uneasy in certain areas, as if they were being watched from the shadows. One crew, sent to clear debris from a particularly hard-hit neighborhood, returned pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen. Local authorities were at a loss. How could so many people disappear without a trace? And what were these strange sightings? No one wanted to admit it, but something about Milton felt wrong and natural even. The storm had unleashed something more than wind and rain, and whatever it wasn't finished. Weeks passed, and the water still hadn't receded. Entire communities remained submerged, their rooftops barely visible above the murky surface. But as the waters stagnated, the strange phenomena increased. Reports of sightings became more frequent. People began to speak of seeing figures moving through the water at night dark, humanoid shapes that glided effortlessly through the floodwaters, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The government sent in specialist biologists, marine experts, even paranormal investigators, but none could offer a reasonable explanation. The creatures, if they existed, left no physical evidence behind, but those who had seen them were adamant. They described the figures as tall, thin, and unnaturally fast, moving through the water as if it were their natural habitat. And then there were the disappearances. People continued to vanish, even in areas where the water had begun to recede. Entire families would be there one day and gone the next, leaving behind perfectly intact homes and a growing sense of dread among the survivors. As the mystery deepened, one man, a local historian, began to dig into the town's past. What he uncovered was chilling. Long before the town was built, the area had been home to a small indigenous tribe who had long spoken of creatures that lived beneath the water. According to their legends, these beings were ancient, older than the land itself, and when disturbed, they would rise from the depths to reclaim what was theirs. The historian shared his findings with anyone who would listen, but most dismissed him as a crackpot, a man trying to make sense of a natural disaster through the lens of folklore. But the disappearances continued, and as the floodwaters showed no sign of retreating, more people began to believe. In the final weeks of the recovery effort, the situation reached a breaking point. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned as people fled inland, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them from the water. The government, desperate to restore order, declared the area a disaster zone and evacuated the remaining residents. But even as they left, the strange sightings persisted. The last rescue crew to leave the area reported hearing a low, rumbling noise coming from the water, a sound unlike anything they had ever heard before. And as they looked back at the flooded ruins of the town, they saw them tall, dark figures moving through the water, their eyes glowing faintly in the fading light.